Hey, Period 5 peeps. We're about to read Chapter 3, which, remember, I've provided you a notes sheet that you are welcome to fill in as you listen and follow along. If that's too much, then you can fill in the notes sheet for Chapter 3 after you either listen or you read. So we're going to start off where we left off. The students were transferred from a bus to a car, and the kidnappers were taking them up a mountain. And that is the picture that our son has drawn for you so that you can visualize. Perhaps this is his version of what a mountain would look like. Here we go. It was dark when they reached the cabin. It had taken them 3 hours, Bruce Kirtland figured, trying to make out the hands of his watch in the dim light that came on in the car when the door was opened. 3 hours spent kneeling in the confinement of the floor space in front of the rear seat had numbed his legs until there was no feeling left in them. He had to grip the door and lean upon it when he got out, stamping his feet against the frozen ground to bring life back. He noticed that Glenn was doing the same. Dexter was in an even worse state. He could not stand at all. "He's pulling a bluff," the woman said, and Buck nodded. "It's not going to get him anywhere." He had a flashlight beside him on the front seat, and now he switched it on, lighting the pathway from the car to the cabin. "Okay, everybody. Rita will go ahead of us and unlock the door. I'll warn you now, there's no place to run, so you'd better not try to make a break for it. You'd be back in 15 minutes, begging us to let you in before you froze." Dexter could not get out of the car. Bruce, who was next to him, could tell that he was trying, could see the tendons standing out in his neck as he strained to pull himself erect, and knew that it was no act. "Here," he said, "let me help you." He stooped and got Dexter's arm across his shoulders and then straightened, staggering a little under the unaccustomed weight. "Sorry," Dexter muttered, "I can't." "I know, it's okay." Glenn stepped in then with support from the other side, taking half the weight on his strong shoulders. Between the two of them, they half-dragged, half-carried the boy across the stretch of ground between the car and the house. They were, Bruce realized, very high in the mountains. His breath was coming in gasps, and he could feel his heart thudding against his chest. The air was thin and bitterly cold, slicing like a knife through the jacket he was wearing and the flannel shirt beneath it. The ground under his feet was hard and slippery with frost. It was very little warmer inside the cabin. Rita flicked the light switch in the wall by the door, and the unshielded bulb in the ceiling brought the interior into glaring view. Glancing quickly about, Bruce could see that it was the crudest sort of hunting lodge. A small kitchen opened directly to the left of the front doorway, and 2 other doors, evidently to bedrooms, opened opposite the front door. The living room was furnished with a wooden table and benches, a sagging couch, and several odd chairs. One entire wall was taken up with a fireplace. A fire was already laid, and Rita went over and lit it. Of one accord, meaning one movement, everyone moved toward the flames, and as the first tongues of heat reached them, Mary Ann let out a little sigh and stretched out her hands to the blaze. Dexter detached his arm from Bruce's shoulders and sank down on the couch and began to rub his legs. Glenn's eyes never flickered from Buck and the pistol. Bruce turned his attention to Jessie, who had sat next to him on the bus. She was standing alone, a little apart from the others. Her face was very pale, and she looked as though she did not quite realize where she was or what had happened. Bruce moved over to stand beside her. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you okay?" Slowly, Jessie nodded. I guess so. We're going to be all right. They aren't going to hurt us." He offered the first words of comfort he could think of. "How do you know they're not?" Jessie asked him. I just don't see why they would." "Why wouldn't they? What is there to stop them? Anyone who would do something like this—" She broke off the sentence, as though suddenly realizing that it was Bruce to whom she was talking. Her voice softened. "You're right. They won't do anything to us. They'll just ask our parents for money and let us go." But it was too late. The doubt in her voice had infected him. He shivered suddenly, chilled inside as well as out. Jessie saw this, and now it was she, with the responsibility of her 3 added years of maturity, who was the comforter. "Don't worry, Bruce. It will be all right. We'll all be home soon. Just wait and see." He was glad that Glenn was not watching him. Glenn, who was never afraid of anything. I'm scared, thought Bruce. Oh my gosh, I'm scared. I want to go home. For one dreadful instant, he thought he had spoken the words aloud. Then, as quickly as it had struck, the wave of panic subsided, leaving him weak and drained. I mustn't disgrace Glenn, he thought determinedly. Whatever I do, I mustn't make him ashamed of me. The cabin was heating slowly. It was stocked with supplies, for Rita had gone into the kitchen and was opening cabinets and taking down cans. Like a picnic, Bruce thought ironically. He wished Glenn would come over and speak to him. In his 15 years, Bruce had never once resented the fact that he was Glenn's younger brother. It was something that other people found hard to understand. Jesse's reaction had been a typical one. How difficult it must be to live always in the shadow of someone like Glenn Kirtland. Yet to Bruce, it had never seemed anything other than a privilege. From the time he had first learned to walk, he had tottered in Glenn's footsteps. He had bypassed the usual first words of Dada and Mama. It had been Glenn. Not even a babyfied version, but the full, solid name. That had been the first word he uttered. One nice thing about Bruce, his mother sometimes commented, is that he doesn't have a jealous bone in his body. He adores his brother. Of course, she could not keep the note of pride from her voice. He has good reason to. Glenn is going to be somebody someday, Mr. Kirtland would assert firmly. Not someday, Mrs. Kirtland would add softly. Glenn is somebody already. To Bruce, Glenn, with his looks and strength, his athletic ability and charm and personality, had seemed to walk like a king, head and shoulders above other people's brothers. They had shared a room when they were little, before the Kirtlands had purchased their home in Valley Gardens, and Bruce, who was a light sleeper, would wake in the night and listen for the sound of Glenn's breathing. Glenn slept hard. Nothing ever woke him. Lying in the darkness, Bruce would fit his own breathing to his brother's, making his chest rise and fall in the same even rhythm, feeling a closeness, a sense of intimacy which he was never able to achieve during the daylight hours. During the day, the 3-year age gap which separated the boys prevented their sharing many activities. Glenn had his set of friends, his clubs and athletics, his school and social life, which were in a realm far beyond Bruce's. Even the odd times they did spend together, there seemed to be a wall between them, an invisible barrier which Bruce could not penetrate. It was not, he told himself firmly, a thing that was Glenn's doing. Glenn was not to blame. Glenn was nice to him, but then Glenn was nice to everybody. It was one of his endearing qualities. Whatever lack of closeness there was between the brothers was due, Bruce was certain, to his own inferiority. Do you know what inferiority means? It means to feel less than someone else. He had so little to offer in comparison with Glenn's wealth of assets. Their relationship was bound to be a lopsided one, with one brother bathed in radiance and the other merely mortal, pretty dull mortal at that. To make up the difference, he tried to make himself useful to Glenn, keeping his things straight, hanging up his clothes when he was too busy to do so, making excuses for him when he was late or careless or forgot things. Like the thing that had happened last Monday night. Bruce had been in his bedroom studying. His parents had gone to a concert, one of the symphonies of which his mother was so fond, and Glenn had been at a meeting. He had been a little after 11 when the Thunderbird pulled into the driveway. Bruce had recognized it at once by the sound of the engine and had laid his books aside and waited for Glenn to come into the house. When 5 minutes elapsed without this happening, he had got up and gone outside to see what was the matter. Glenn was standing in the driveway, holding a flashlight, examining a dent in the front fender. There was a scrape as well, running along the side of the car as far as the door. Glenn? What the devil do you think you're doing, sneaking up behind me like that? Bruce was not prepared for his brother's startled reaction. I wasn't sneaking. I just came out to see what was holding you up so long. He moved in for a closer look at the fender. What happened? I got swiped by a car, Glenn said grimly. He came out of a side street and went right through a stop sign. I never even saw him until he hit me. Gee. Bruce reached out and ran his finger along the scrape mark. You're lucky it wasn't any worse. You better call in and report it. That is, if you want your insurance to cover it. It won't, Glenn said shortly. Why not? If the other guy was covered. He never stopped, Glenn said. He just swung past and kept going. I didn't even get his license number. Besides, he paused. What? Bruce regarded him with curiosity. Besides what? I let the policy lapse. You let it lapse? Bruce stared at him incredulously. Good gosh, Glenn, how did you come to do that? Dad will hit the ceiling. To let a insurance policy lapse, that means to let it expire. As you know, if you own a vehicle, you have to pay for insurance in order to drive it legally. And this is something Glenn just let happen here. He won't have to know about it, I hope. Glenn was frowning thoughtfully. I've got the cash I was saving toward new skis. I can use that to get the repairs done and then pick up the policy again next month. But don't you have to report accidents? Bruce asked. Won't they have to know at the garage that it was reported? I won't say it was a 2-car accident. I'll just say that I scraped against a fence post or something. Glenn stood quietly, thinking through the details. If I park the car over to the side of the driveway, Dad won't notice the fender when he comes in tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll get it into the shop. He won't even have to know. He'll know the car is missing, said Bruce. I'll tell him I'm getting a new paint job. He won't question that. He paused. Say, Brucey? He flicked off the flashlight. Yes? Bruce strained to see his face in the sudden darkness. Glenn's voice was strange, as though it belonged to somebody else. You won't say anything, will you? I mean, about tonight, about the accident. If they ask you where the car is, you'll say it's being painted? There's no reason they should ask me, Bruce said slowly. They probably won't, but there's always the chance. I mean, you will keep your mouth closed about this, won't you? If Dad found out about the lapse policy, he'd have fits. He'd put me on probation for months. He might even take the car away. I don't want to lie, Bruce told him. I don't like having you lie either. Bruce, for gosh sakes, who in the world is it going to hurt? I've learned my lesson. I'll never let the insurance go again. You can be darn sure of that. What's going to be accomplished by Dad's knowing except a lot of unpleasantness? There was a note of pleading in his voice. Isn't that what brothers are for? To help each other? I'd back you up if it were the other way around. Well, it was so unlike Glenn's usual way of speaking. Glenn, who was always so self-confident. Come on, kid, be a sport. The night was cold, and Bruce was not wearing a jacket. He shivered and hugged himself in the darkness. Well, okay. Thanks, you're a good guy. Glenn put his hand on his shoulder. It felt good there, friendly and comradely. The warmth of it went through the thin material of his shirt and filled Bruce with a sudden feeling of happiness, the same kind of closeness he had felt as a child, breathing with Glenn in the night. That's all right, he said. You're a good guy, Glenn said again, and kept his hand on his shoulder, walking beside him as they went into the house. Now, in the cold of the cabin, Bruce wished he could bring that feeling back again. Glenn was here. They were in this thing together. The knowledge was a comfort, yet it would have been better, so much better, if Glenn had come over and stood beside him. The cans Rita had opened contained stew, and when it was hot, she served it on paper plates at the long table. She and Buck took their own plates to the kitchen where they could be seen through the open door, eating and talking together in low voices. I wonder, Marianne said softly, what they're saying. They're probably discussing the ransom, Glenn hazarded. How much money do you suppose they'll ask for us? As much as the traffic will bear, said Dexter. They'll ask one amount, and then, if it looks as though that will be paid without argument, they'll up it. If I know my uncle, he'd tell them to go to blazes. I bet he doesn't come through with 1 penny. My mother won't know what to do. Jessie had not touched her food. She sat staring at the plate in front of her as though unaware of its existence. We don't have that kind of money. We're a service family. We don't belong in a place like Valley Gardens. People can get money if they have to, Marianne said comfortingly. My parents don't live together, but I'm sure Mother will call Daddy and he will come through somehow, even if he has to borrow. After all, we're their children. But Mother won't be able to get a hold of my father, Jessie said. He's off somewhere on temporary duty. We don't even know when he'll be back. Our parents will pay, Bruce uttered the words in a kind of desperation. They can sell stocks and things. They will, won't they, Glenn? Of course, Glenn said. For the first time, he seemed to focus his full attention upon his brother and see the need for reassurance. Don't get all shook up, Brucey. We'll get out of here. But when? Bruce asked shakily. How long will they keep us? Dexter was the one who answered. As short a time as possible. Keeping us is a risk. They'll want to get rid of us as soon as they can and pocket the money and take off. He turned to Jessie, who was seated beside him, and his voice grew gentler. Aren't you going to eat? She shook her head. I'm not hungry. You better eat anyway. You need something in you. I can't, Jessie said weakly. She reached out and shoved the plate away and covered her face with her hands. Bruce thought she was going to cry again. He had watched her crying in the car on the way up the mountain, and he did not think he could bear to watch it now. Don't, he said, please. His own control was balanced on a fine edge. He picked up his fork, concentrating on keeping it steady. He thought, I will not make Glenn ashamed of me. Buck, who had been watching them through the kitchen door, got up and came into the living room. He stood for a moment, looking down at the group at the table, and then asked, How is everybody doing? His voice was pleasant, even friendly, as though he were the host at a party. When no one answered, he said, We're not running a restaurant here, you know. Our supplies are limited. If I were you, I'd go ahead and eat. Marianne raised her head and met his eyes defiantly. What are you going to do with us? She asked. How long do you think you can keep us here? Our families must have all the police in New Mexico out looking for us by this time. I doubt that. I think your parents have more sense than to disobey instructions. Buck's eyes crinkled in amusement. You're a spunky little gal, aren't you? How come you're not crying like your friend here? He gestured toward Jessie, whose shoulders were heaving with silent sobs. Marianne ignored the question. I want to know what you're planning to do with us. Well, seeing as how you've asked me so nicely. Buck paused for effect, as though considering the possibilities. I could tie you up and pile you in the corner. That would save me from having to watch you all night. Or I could lock you in the storeroom off the kitchen. It would be pretty cold out there, away from the fire and all. He waited a moment for her reaction. Marianne regarded him coldly. Her face did not change expression. Or, Buck continued slowly, I might decide that you are smart enough to know that your best bet is to cooperate. I have a gun and the keys to the station wagon. If I let you all walk out of here right now, there wouldn't be any place for you to go. The closest town is a good 20 miles from here. You'd freeze to death before you made it on foot, with no more clothes than you have. We're up about 11,000 feet, you know. If we do cooperate, Glenn said, if we agree not to make trouble, will we be allowed to sleep in the bunk rooms with the doors open for heat? I might consider it. Buck was enjoying himself. Jessie lowered her hands from her face. You are going to let us go, aren't you? I mean later? Bruce gave up trying to eat. With an effort, he swallowed the food that was in his mouth and laid the fork on his plate. He felt his hands clenching into fists as he awaited the answer. Of course you'll go home. What do you think we want to do? Adopt you? A great family we'd make, Rita and me, and our 5 lovely kids, and dear Uncle Juan dropping in to visit every now and then. He grinned at her. Rita, coming in to stand beside him, was not smiling. Stop joking around with them, Buck. There's no reason to. We might as well enjoy our little visitors. He turned his grin upon her. What's the matter with you, anyway? You getting jealous? Jealous? Rita stared at him. What are you talking about? Of this little blonde spitfire here. She is pretty cute. I like to see a girl with spirit. Now wait a minute. Dexter stiffened in his seat, but Glenn was already on his feet. You watch the way you talk about these girls. You don't have any right. Oh, you forget, buddy boy. I have a pistol. It gives me a right to do anything I want to do. The amusement was gone from Buck's voice. Sit down. Glenn did not move. Standing there in the firelight, his shoulders a broad silhouette against the glow, his strong young body straight with defiance, he seemed to Bruce to be a kind of god, a symbol of courage and strength, one step above mortal men. Pistol or no pistol, you leave the girls alone. Glenn, Marianne's eyes widened in horror. Don't do anything. She clutched at his arm. Please. He's not going to insult you girls. There aren't going to be any compromises in that direction. That has to be understood. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be drawn down into his seat. He's right, Buck. There was a flatness to Rita's voice. You leave those girls alone. That's not part of this. I am the one who makes the rules around here, Buck said coldly. His eyes were on Glenn. You're going to make trouble once too often, son. As it is, you've talked yourself and your buddies into a night in the storeroom. Get back there now. If you're lucky, you may find a couple of blankets back there. Dexter threw a quick glance at Jessie. Can't the girls sleep in the bunk room? You know they won't make trouble. Mary Ann's chin was set. I don't want to sleep here. I'd rather freeze with the rest of you. You'll do what you're told. Sorry about that. You'll do what you're told. Buck's decision was made. You three boys, get into the storeroom. Girls, you help Rita clear the table. Bruce got up obediently. His original terror had turned to numbness. Jessie reached over and touched his hand. We'll see you in the morning, Brucey. It was a silly thing to say, but the touch was comforting, and the fact that it was Jessie, pale-faced and trembling herself, who had thought to say it. Glenn was looking at Mary Ann. You'll be okay? Yes. Get a move on, Buck said, and Bruce hesitated, waiting for some sign from his brother. Instead, it was Dexter who, with a gesture foreign to him, put an arm around the young boy's shoulders and said, Come on, fellow. It can't be as bad in there as they make it out to be, and walked with him through the warmth of the kitchen into the little room filled with darkness and cold. And that concludes Chapter 3. Stay tuned for Chapter 4.